You know how sometimes you read something or you hear something and other images instantly jump into your head, and sometimes you try and say those things out loud to other people and they look at you like, why, what? I'm about to do that, just in case you're wondering. I hear that story this morning and several things immediately jump in my head. One of which is, even here on the prairies on a bright sunny day, it's awkward talking about this story this morning when you see all those pictures from the Maritimes and from Puerto Rico, and there's another one coming, right? And so it becomes a very real thing. The second is, on Friday night that we, not to move on, this is a really bad segue, but not to move on too quickly from that, because it should be on our minds today. But on Friday night, we showed a movie here at the church. It was Thor, Love and Thunder. And there's a scene in it where Thor's friend Korg, he's the guy who's made of stone. I'm sure you've all seen the movies. And I'm not, this isn't a spoiler. This isn't a spoiler because he doesn't die, but he gets hit with Zeus's thunderbolt. Watch the movie. And he immediately starts to disintegrate because he's made of stone. Turns out, though, that on his planet, their existence is all centered in their face, and particularly in their mouth. And so they save his face, and then he regrows himself. Anyway, you have to see it. But the thing is, as he's starting to fall apart, he says to Thor, "I'm perishing." He wasn't, but he says, I think, he certainly felt that way. And so you can see how, like in a storm, even fishermen, experienced fishermen, in a big storm, they're perishing. And that word just kind of stuck in my head from it. The other thing is, as it happens, the answer to the question, do we have any faith, is no, because Faith is not here this morning. Terry is here this morning, but Faith is at a quilting thing somewhere else. So she's in town, but we're not. It's funny how things immediately leap into your head when you hear a story and you start making connections to other things. And quite often, those things that you make connections to have nothing to do with how somebody told you what this story really means. So we've talked about this story of that Jesus says to the disciples, let's cross over to the other side of the lake. They get in the boat. They go out on the lake. Jesus has had a tough day. He's sleeping in the back. What would you expect? He's been working hard. And a storm comes up, which somehow doesn't wake him up. But still, the disciples are working hard at trying to keep the boat afloat. Big storm. They're fishermen, remember, experienced fishermen who know the lake. And they think this is it, right? The end is near. And so they wake up Jesus. And they don't say, just to be clear, they don't say, save us. They say, hey, have you not noticed we're in trouble? It certainly seems like an appeal for help, though. And Jesus wakes up, and he calms the storm and stills the sea. Stills the sea and calms the storm. I forget how that goes. It's one or the other. But suddenly there's according to Mark, dead calm. And he asks the disciples, why are you scared? Don't you have any faith? Still have no faith. How long do we think they've been following him around? We're only in chapter 4. But then the disciples, and just to be clear about the fear here, it's not so much they're afraid, it's of Jesus. They're in awe, right? This is super amazing. Who the heck is this guy that even nature obeys, right? Which is it's a great story on a whole number of levels. Traditionally, it's a great story because it's a story of it's a miracle story of Jesus, right? He performs a miracle. Jesus is so powerful that even nature obeys him. It's the power of God. This is Jesus demonstrating the power of God. In fact, that whole thing about calming the storm and stilling the sea, or whichever one of those it is, that ought to remind you of a bunch of things from Hebrew Scripture. There's all sorts of references to God and nature in Hebrew Scripture, not to mention, like right at the beginning in Genesis, the Spirit of God moved over the waters, right? It's part of the creation story that God is. And here's my little thing about this being a miracle story where Jesus controls things, is I would be a lot happier if this story were told about how Jesus works with nature to calm the storm, rather than has dominion over, oh, I used that word, didn't I? Because that's often how we hear that creation story, is that we have dominion. We have power over. No, we don't. In fact, lately it's been demonstrated very clearly we don't have power over nature. Here, the power of God seems to be able to control nature. So it's a miracle story that demonstrates that Jesus clearly is of God. That's great as it stands. As a miracle story, that's awesome. We sometimes also interpret it as it's not the storm in nature that is calmed, it is the storm in us. Right? It becomes a metaphor. The story is a parable, essentially, of how turning to Jesus helps calm the storm in us. The busyness of the world, it brings us to stillness, our nature to stillness. In fact, you could easily interpret it that way in the context of the story, right? Is that the storm that Jesus stills isn't actually the weather, it's the anxiety and emotion that's going on with the disciples in the boat. And because they have been calmed, they are able to ride the storm out, working with nature, ride the storm out and get to the other side. Also great, because again, it reminds us that turning to Jesus helps calm us and bring peace to us. God's peace comes upon us, and we are able to then engage the world around us more effectively. Also great. Thing, though, is, as great as both of those ways of hearing this story are, they both rely on the moment in which we turn to God for help. We turn to God, and God fixes the moment for us, and then we get to the other side. It's all good. And we did what? See, it doesn't say in the story the way Mark tells this story. In fact, this story appears in 3 of the 4 Gospels, and nowhere in any of those 3 tellings of the story does it say the storm of whether it was the storm of nature or the storm within the disciples was calmed, and they then immediately knew what to do and were able to guide the boat safely to the other side. And here's what happened in the next 2 hours that it took them to get to the other side. It just says they got to the other side. There's no mention that they had to do anything at all because, after all, they turned to Jesus and Jesus saved them. Jesus saves. They didn't seem to have to do anything. I have a little bit of an issue with that. Because I hear other things in the story, too, as you probably did, too. Because the story begins with, come with me into the boat. The story begins with an invitation to actually get in the boat in the first place. So if you're going to understand this story as being metaphorically about how turning to Jesus in the moment of a storm can be calming and help us, you might want to think about how you got into that moment in the storm in the first place. You might also want to remember that if you answer that invitation to get into the boat, you better be prepared to understand that God is there all the time, not just in the moments that you need God. Jesus invites them to get into the boat. Experienced fishermen, by the way, get in the boat late in the day. It's getting dark. None of them said, it's getting dark, maybe we should wait till morning. None of them said, what if a storm comes up, Jesus? Maybe we should wait till morning. Or better still, let's walk around. After all, we left our boats behind, remember? But they don't. They trust Jesus, and they get in the boat. And off they go. They've taken the first step on the journey. And it's not just a step on a journey, it's a step on a journey with Jesus in the boat. They get out on the water, the storm comes up, and they turn to Jesus. But then what? It's not just a moment, the journey continues. It's almost like that whole idea of let's get in the boat and sail to where? The other side. There is a destination. Well, they don't know what's going to happen on the other side. And as it turns out in Mark, it's a guy who's possessed. But nonetheless, they don't know what's there, but they trust to get in the boat to go to the other side. They're ready to travel. They're ready to step out on the journey. It's almost like there's hope offered in that they are going to the other side, even though the specifics of what's waiting them there isn't in the story. They still get in the boat. The invitation to understand that God is with us always isn't just about turning to God in the moments that we are desperate for help. It's about knowing God in all of the moments in our lives, being present in all of the moments in our lives. And that we have a part in that. Even if the story is a miracle story where Jesus displays the power of God to calm nature, they still had to keep going to the other side. And if it was a dead calm, they weren't using a sail. They were going to have to row. So however you want to hear that part of the story, they still had something to do to get to the other side. They still had something to do to keep going forward in the journey. And that's the thing. The journey continues, and they keep going forward. The journey continues, and they keep going forward, knowing that God is with them. In the storm, in the dead calm, in the nice, smooth, placid waves, and just perfect breeze that would carry them gently across the lake. God is there. We listen for God and reach out to God, not just in the moments of the storm, but in the moments of peace. In fact, quite often, the moments of peacefulness are the times when we most can hear the stories that we need to hear. It's quite often those moments where we find God's peace around us enough that we can hear the most difficult of stories, even the stories we don't really want to hear. This Friday being Orange Shirt Day can't just be one day. You can't just kind of put the shirt on for the day and go, yep, I did my part. Every day, there are moments that we need to take a moment of peace and hear stories and understand what's going on with people and try and find a way forward in the journey of that relationship. And we can because God is with us.